The moment I realized something was wrong, my stomach dropped. I was standing on a dusty hill overlooking my late grandfather's land, expecting silence and open sky. Instead, I saw rooftops. Dozens of them. Perfect rows of brand new houses stretched across the property like a copied and pasted dream. Streets, driveways, mailboxes, even a decorative fountain at the entrance. 100 homes, maybe more, sitting exactly where cattle once grazed. And the terrifying part? No one had ever asked me for permission. This land had been in my family for 3 generations. It wasn't listed for sale, leased, or zoned for development. Yet there it was, a full suburban neighborhood buzzing with life. Kids rode bikes. Sprinklers hissed. A woman waved at me like I belonged there. I didn't. And apparently, neither did they. At first, I assumed there had been some massive clerical error. Maybe the county sold it accidentally. Maybe a forged signature slipped through. I drove straight to the HOA office at the front gate, heart pounding, questions rehearsed. The manager smiled politely, tapped on her keyboard, and said something that changed everything. According to our records, this entire community was approved years ago. Approved by who? Certainly not me. When I asked for permits, deeds, or proof of ownership, the room shifted. Voices tightened. Smiles vanished. They handed me glossy brochures instead of documents, insisting everything was handled by their developer. That's when I knew I wasn't dealing with a mistake. I was dealing with a secret. Over the next few days, I stopped sleeping. I pulled property records, survey maps, and zoning files. Every document screamed the same truth. The land was mine. Taxes paid. Boundaries clear. No easements. No sale. No permits. Somehow, an HOA and a developer had quietly built an entire neighborhood on property they didn't own. Most people would panic. Some would walk away. I didn't. Because buried inside that nightmare was an opportunity so shocking it felt unreal. If the law said the land was mine, and the houses were permanently attached to it, then legally, so were the homes. 100 houses. One signature. One unbelievable discovery. And the HOA had no idea what was coming next. I kept quiet, played confused, and listened while they explained rules, fees, and violations as if I were just another resident. Every sentence gave me leverage. Every assumption they made pushed them deeper. They thought paperwork could bury the truth. They thought money could fix everything. What they didn't know was that I had already spoken to an attorney who went silent halfway through my story, then laughed, then said 4 words I will never forget: "You own all of it." And once ownership is proven, consequences arrive fast for everyone. By the time my attorney finished reviewing the records, the situation was no longer confusing, it was explosive. He spread the documents across his desk like evidence in a crime drama: original deeds, county plats, tax receipts with my family name stamped year after year. Not a single transfer. Not a single permit authorizing construction. What the HOA had built wasn't just questionable. It was illegal. Still, owning something on paper and enforcing it in reality are 2 very different battles. My lawyer warned me to move carefully. If I stormed in too early, the HOA would scramble to cover their tracks. So instead, we watched. Quietly. Over the next few weeks, I learned everything about that neighborhood. The developer had gone bankrupt right after finishing construction. The HOA took over management and pretended everything was normal. Homeowners paid fees, followed rules, and had no idea the ground beneath their houses belonged to someone else. The HOA issued fines, enforced paint colors, and threatened liens, all while sitting on land they didn't own. Then came the moment that changed the entire power dynamic. I received a certified letter from the HOA. Apparently, my property violated community standards. They demanded I remove my truck from the dirt road and pay a fine. I stared at the letter, stunned by the irony. They were trying to find the actual landowner for trespassing on his own land. That letter became our opening move. My attorney drafted a response that was polite, devastating, and airtight. It stated my ownership, included copies of the deed, and formally demanded proof of their legal right to occupy the land. We gave them 10 business days to respond. No threats. No emotion. Just facts. The HOA panicked. Emails flooded in. Meetings were postponed. Their lawyer requested extensions. When they finally replied, their explanation collapsed under its own weight. They blamed the developer. They claimed good faith. They suggested a quiet settlement. But there was one problem they couldn't escape. Under state law, structures built without permission on private land belong to the landowner unless otherwise proven. That meant the houses weren't just improperly placed. They were legally mine. Once that reality sank in, the tone changed completely. The HOA stopped fining me. Board members requested meetings. Homeowners began whispering. Someone leaked the situation online, and suddenly my phone wouldn't stop ringing. Reporters wanted comments. Residents wanted reassurance. The HOA wanted mercy. But I wasn't angry at the families living there. They were victims too. My issue was with the HOA executives who had signed contracts they didn't understand and gambled with land that wasn't theirs. They had collected millions in dues while ignoring the most basic rule of development: you must own the land. Now the clock was ticking. Either the HOA could negotiate from a position of honesty, or the law would decide for them publicly, painfully, and permanently. And the next step would determine whether this ended in a settlement, or a total collapse of their entire community. The HOA requested an emergency meeting, and this time, they didn't send a receptionist. They sent lawyers. 3 of them sat across from me in a glass conference room, smiling too hard, speaking too softly, as if volume alone could trigger disaster. They framed the situation as a misunderstanding, a technical oversight, something fixable with signatures and silence. I listened without interrupting, because every sentence revealed fear. They offered money first. A buyout. A generous one, they said, as if generosity could rewrite ownership. I declined. Then they offered to purchase the land retroactively, promising to handle permits and back taxes. I declined again. Finally, they asked what I wanted. That question mattered, because it meant they accepted the truth, even if they hated it. What I wanted was transparency and accountability. My attorney explained the legal position calmly. Under state law, improvements permanently attached to land belong to the landowner unless a valid agreement exists. No agreement existed. No permits existed. No easements existed. That meant the HOA controlled nothing without my consent. Roads, utilities, signage, and yes, every house. The room went silent. Within days, homeowners received notices that shook the neighborhood. Not eviction notices, but disclosures. They were informed that the HOA did not own the land beneath their homes and that negotiations were underway. Panic followed. Town halls filled. Rumors exploded. Some residents accused the HOA of fraud. Others begged me not to tear everything down. I didn't plan to. Destroying lives wasn't my goal. Fixing wrongdoing was. The county stepped in next. Inspectors reviewed permits and found none. Fines stacked up fast. The HOA board resigned one by one. The management company terminated its contract. Suddenly, no one was in charge. Except me. I was offered media interviews daily. I refused most of them. Public pressure complicates legal clarity. Instead, I focused on structure. We created a temporary land use agreement allowing residents to remain while ownership issues were resolved. It stabilized things and showed good faith. Behind the scenes, lawsuits formed. Homeowners sued the developer's estate. The HOA sued everyone, including itself, it seemed. And I filed a quiet action to formally confirm ownership of all improvements on the land. It wasn't flashy, but it was final. When the judge signed the order, it didn't make headlines immediately. But legally, unmistakably, one fact became permanent. I was no longer just the landowner. I was the owner of 100 houses, a neighborhood, and a problem no one else wanted. And the hardest decisions were still ahead. Ownership brought responsibility, leverage, and risk, forcing me to choose between profit, justice, and stability, knowing every choice would reshape lives, laws, and my future forever without any mercy. The day ownership was officially confirmed, my phone didn't stop ringing. Banks called first. Then insurance companies. Then utility providers who suddenly realized their contracts were tied to an HOA that legally owned nothing. The neighborhood had crossed into a strange limbo where people lived normal lives inside houses that technically had no rightful manager except me. And I had never planned to run a town. I drove through the community slowly, noticing details I'd missed before. Cracked sidewalks already forming. Storm drains installed slightly off-grade. Cheap fencing warping in the sun. The developer had cut corners everywhere, assuming no one would ever question them. Now those shortcuts were my responsibility, whether I liked it or not. Residents began approaching me directly. Some were polite. Some were terrified. A few were angry, demanding answers as if I had caused this. I listened to all of them. Parents worried about mortgages. Elderly couples feared eviction. Young families asked if they would lose everything. I told them the truth, no one was being thrown out, but the future depended on cooperation. That's when I made a decision that surprised everyone, including my attorney. Instead of selling immediately or forcing renegotiations, I offered temporary land leases to every homeowner. Modest, fair, and legally binding. It allowed them to stay, protected their residency, and bought time while we figured out permanent solutions. The reaction was instant relief mixed with confusion. No one expected the landowner to be reasonable. The HOA, what remained of it, was furious. Without control, they were powerless. Their rules meant nothing. Their fines were void. Their authority evaporated overnight. They accused me of undermining the community, ignoring the fact that they had built it on a lie. Then the banks realized something terrifying. Mortgages were written on homes whose underlying land ownership had never been verified. That meant loans were unsecured. Titles were flawed. Entire portfolios were suddenly at risk. Behind closed doors, lenders began negotiating with me quietly, hoping to stabilize the situation before regulators noticed. That leverage changed everything. Developers who once ignored my calls now begged for meetings. The county offered expedited hearings. Even the state requested documentation. What started as a property dispute had turned into a legal earthquake, exposing how easily systems trusted paperwork without verification. At night, I sat with spreadsheets and maps, calculating options. I could sell the land at a premium. I could restructure ownership. I could turn the neighborhood into a cooperative. Every path had consequences. Every delay added pressure. 100 houses meant 100 lives intertwined with a mistake they didn't make. I had power, but also responsibility. And the next move would decide whether the story ended with headlines about greed, or a case study taught in law schools for decades. Pressure peaked when the first bank threatened foreclosure not against the homeowner, but against the HOA itself. They wanted someone to blame, someone to absorb the loss, and suddenly all eyes turned to me. I was the legal owner of the land and the structures, yet none of the financial benefits had ever reached me. Still, responsibility has a way of drifting uphill. My attorney warned me this was the most dangerous phase. Not because I could lose, but because I could win too aggressively. Courts don't punish ownership, but they scrutinize intent. If I appeared predatory, the narrative could turn against me fast. So every move had to be measured, documented, and defensible. I proposed a framework no one expected. Instead of fighting the banks, I invited them to the table. Representatives from 3 major lenders sat with my legal team for an entire weekend. We laid out the facts: flawed titles, unsecured loans, illegal development. Then I offered a path forward. I would sell the land beneath each house directly to the homeowners at a fair, pre-development valuation. In return, banks would restructure mortgages to include the land properly, correcting the defect. It wasn't charity. It was strategy. The banks would avoid massive write-downs. Homeowners would gain clean titles. And I would be paid for land that had been taken without permission. Everyone would lose something, but no one would be destroyed. Negotiations were brutal. Appraisals were challenged. Lawyers argued semantics. But the alternative: years of litigation and regulatory scrutiny was worse. One by one, lenders agreed. When the first homeowner signed a corrected deed, something shifted. Fear turned into relief. Anger softened into gratitude. Word spread quickly. Lines formed at my attorney's office. People brought coffee, thank you notes, even apologies for yelling at me weeks earlier. I didn't take it personally. Stress makes enemies out of strangers. The HOA, however, was finished. Former board members faced civil suits. Investigations opened into permit offices and inspectors who signed off without verifying ownership. The developers' shell companies unraveled, exposing how easily the system could be exploited if enough people looked the other way. By the end of the month, 67 homes were fully resolved. Clean land deeds. Corrected mortgages. A future restored. The remaining cases were complicated, but manageable. What shocked me most wasn't the money. It was the silence. No dramatic courtroom showdown. No eviction trucks. Just paperwork, accountability, and a slow return to normal life for people who never asked to be part of a scandal. But the story wasn't over yet. Because the final phase wouldn't involve banks, HOAs, or courts. It would involve a choice that would define how this ended and how I would be remembered long after the last document was signed. As the legal chaos settled, something unexpected happened. I started receiving letters. Not from lawyers or banks, but from residents. Handwritten notes. Long emails. Stories about sleepless nights, kids asking if they'd have to move, marriages strained under uncertainty. One message stood out. A teacher wrote that this neighborhood was the first place her family had ever truly felt safe, and she feared one signature could erase that. I realized then this was no longer just a legal problem. It was a human one. Financially, I was already whole. The land sales covered what had been taken, plus damages. I didn't need to squeeze anything more out of this situation. But legally, I still owned the roads, common areas, green spaces, and several unsold homes the developer had abandoned. Those assets carried power, and power demands a final decision. My attorney presented the cleanest option: sell everything to a corporate investor. They would assume control, restructure the HOA, and I could walk away forever. The offer was massive. Life-changing. The kind of number people dream about and regret turning down later. I almost said yes. Then I drove through the neighborhood one last time, alone. I watched kids drawing chalk on sidewalks that technically belonged to me. I saw neighbors chatting at mailboxes, unaware that a boardroom decision could upend everything again. It felt wrong to hand them over to a faceless entity after everything they'd endured. So I chose the harder path. I dissolved the HOA entirely. Using my ownership of the land and common areas, I created a resident-controlled trust. Every homeowner who had resolved their land purchase received voting rights. No fines for profit. No hidden management contracts. Budgets would be transparent. Rules would require majority approval. The community would govern itself. The reaction was disbelief. Then relief. Then pride. Local news finally broke the story, but the headline surprised me. It wasn't about greed or scandal. It was about accountability. About a landowner who could have taken everything, but chose stability instead. That coverage mattered. Regulators paid attention. New safeguards were proposed. Permit offices tightened verification processes. Quietly, the system learned. There were still loose ends. Lawsuits dragged on. A few homeowners chose to sell and leave, unable to shake the stress. I respected that. Healing doesn't look the same for everyone. When the last document was signed, I stood where this all began, on that same hill overlooking the land. The rooftops were still there, but now they felt earned, legitimate, grounded. What started as an invasion had become a correction. I didn't just end up owning 100 houses. I ended up owning a decision. And in the end, that mattered more than the land, the money, or the headlines ever could. Just when I thought the worst was behind me, the state got involved. A formal inquiry was launched into how an entire neighborhood could be built without a single verified permit tied to rightful ownership. Investigators didn't come looking for sympathy. They came looking for precedent. My case had quietly become a reference point, and that made me both useful and vulnerable. I was subpoenaed to testify, not as a suspect, but as the anchor of the timeline. Every email, every meeting, every lease agreement I'd signed was examined. They wanted to know when I found out, how I responded, and whether I had ever considered stopping construction earlier. The truth was uncomfortable. The system never notified me. It never checked. It simply assumed. During testimony, one official admitted something shocking. My land had been flagged during early development, but the warning was overwritten due to administrative backlog. That single phrase explained millions in risk, hundreds of lives disrupted, and years of unchecked negligence. It wasn't corruption in the movie sense. It was worse. It was indifference. The inquiry's findings triggered consequences fast. Several county employees were suspended. New verification protocols were mandated statewide. Title insurers updated requirements. Developers began facing stricter audits. What happened on my land forced change far beyond my property line. Meanwhile, the neighborhood continued healing. Block parties replaced emergency meetings. Residents volunteered for trust committees. People who barely spoke before now shared tools and meals. Crisis had forged community in a way no HOA rulebook ever could. I was invited to speak at a real estate law conference. Standing at the podium, I looked out at attorneys scribbling notes, developers frowning, regulators listening carefully. I told them the truth. This wasn't about clever lawyering. It was about basic due diligence that everyone skipped because it was easier not to look too closely. After the talk, a young lawyer approached me and said, "They'll teach this case for decades." That was when it hit me. This story was bigger than one neighborhood. It was a warning. Not long after, I received the final settlement notice. All remaining claims resolved. All disputes closed. The land I still owned, parks, walkways, shared spaces, was permanently transferred to the resident trust for $1. Symbolic. Final. Clean. As I drove away for the last time, I expected relief. Instead, I felt something quieter. Closure. The kind that doesn't cheer, but settles. What began with shock ended with reform. And though my role was central, the real lesson belonged to everyone who thought ownership was just paperwork. Because the truth is, land remembers. And when ignored long enough, it always demands to be heard. Months after everything was resolved, I thought the story was finally over. The lawsuits were closed, the trust was functioning, and my name had slowly faded from daily conversations in the neighborhood. That's when the unintended consequences began to surface. Other landowners started calling me. Quietly at first. Then urgently. They had heard rumors. Partial versions. Whispers of what happened when someone actually checked their boundaries. One man owned farmland outside the city. Another inherited desert property he'd never visited. A woman discovered utility lines running through land she still paid taxes on. My case had given people permission to ask uncomfortable questions, and the answers were rarely reassuring. Developers moved fast. Oversight moved slow. And assumptions filled the gap. State officials requested my input while drafting new legislation. I wasn't a lawmaker, but I was evidence. I explained how easily trust replaced verification, how signatures were accepted without cross-checking deeds, how entire systems relied on momentum instead of confirmation. They listened carefully, because my case had already cost insurers and lenders more than anyone wanted to admit publicly. Meanwhile, the neighborhood I once feared had become something unexpected. I received an invitation to their annual gathering. Not a legal obligation. A genuine request. I almost didn't go. Part of me felt like an outsider who no longer belonged. But curiosity won. When I arrived, no one treated me like a villain or a savior. I was just the person who happened to notice. Kids ran past me without a second glance. Someone handed me a plate of food. A man raised a toast, thanking everyone for getting through that year. Not mentioning my name at all. That felt right. Walking those streets, I realized something subtle. Ownership isn't just legal control. It's stewardship. Even when temporary, even when unwanted. I had been handed power through someone else's mistake, and what mattered wasn't that I owned 100 houses. It was that I didn't forget the people inside them. Financially, I walked away comfortable, not extravagant. The massive windfall some imagined never materialized, and I didn't miss it. What I gained instead was perspective. Systems fail quietly. People pay loudly. And integrity shows up when no rule requires it. As I drove away that night, the lights of the neighborhood faded into the distance. It no longer felt like stolen land or accidental property. It felt like a place that had survived something together. I thought about how close the story came to ending very differently. One aggressive choice. One impatient move. One signature without restraint. The law would have allowed it. But history would have remembered it another way. And that's when I understood the final twist of all this. The biggest thing I owned wasn't land or houses. It was the ending. And I chose it carefully. By the time I returned home for good, the storm had passed, but the ripples remained. Headlines no longer screamed about me or the HOA. Banks quietly adjusted their portfolios. Regulators closed their investigations. Even the developer's tangled estate had mostly dissolved. The 100 houses were now part of a functioning, resident-run trust, a living example of how a neighborhood could survive a legal disaster. I often think back to that first day on the hill, staring at rooftops that shouldn't have existed. Fear, anger, disbelief, they all felt raw and immediate. But those emotions, intense as they were, couldn't have prepared me for what came next, the weight of responsibility. Owning land is one thing. Owning the lives and investments of hundreds of people is another entirely. Every choice reverberates. Every decision has consequences. Over time, I realized something surprising. Power isn't measured by the number of houses you own or the money you control, it's measured by how you wield it when no one is forcing your hand. I could have sold the land for a fortune, collected every dollar, and walked away. I could have evicted the HOA, wiped out dues, or forced compliance with merciless efficiency. Legally, I could have destroyed the very system that had failed me. But I didn't. Choosing restraint and fairness, choosing people over paper, changed everything. Today, when I drive through that neighborhood, I no longer see a scandal or a mistake. I see resilience. I see children riding bikes on streets that were almost a source of conflict. I see neighbors planting gardens, organizing events, and learning to govern themselves responsibly. And I see the unexpected reward of doing the right thing, even when the right thing wasn't the easiest or the most profitable. The story made waves, yes, but the quiet moments matter more. Conversations with residents thanking me for listening. Seeing disputes resolved without lawyers. Watching a system rebuilt stronger than before. That is what ownership really means: accountability, foresight, and care. In the end, this isn't just a story about 100 houses or a rogue HOA. It's a story about discovery, power, and choice. About how a single person, armed with the truth and a little patience, can transform chaos into order, and injustice into opportunity. And most importantly, it's about the fact that even in a world full of mistakes, fairness can prevail if you insist on it. And so, from an impossible situation that began with shock and disbelief, came a neighborhood saved, a system corrected, and a life changed not by wealth or anger, but by the simple courage to do what's right.